In the cold corridors of the company's headquarters, a man was carefully observing the numbers in the report. Everything indicated that profits were good, that productivity was high, and that the factory was operating at maximum efficiency. On paper, it looked perfect, but then came the rumors. Whispers of exhausted employees, stories of abusive supervisors, and, worst of all, the fear that hung in the air. Something was wrong, but no one dared speak to him directly. It was strange. After all, he was not a distant boss. He liked to believe his company was more than just machines and numbers, but the more he tried to look for answers, the more doors closed. Why didn't anyone speak? What were they hiding? Determined to discover the truth, he realized there was only one way to do it: see it with his own eyes. But not like the untouchable CEO everyone knew. No, he needed to be one of them. Over the next few days, he came up with a bold plan. No suit, no luxurious car, no indication that he was the owner of the company. Just an ordinary employee looking for work. He wanted to know what the lives of those who supported his empire were like. He wanted to feel the weight of the routine, the tiredness of long journeys, and, above all, discover what was happening behind the scenes at the factory. What he didn't know was that this decision would change his life forever, and that, upon crossing those gates, he would not only encounter an administrative problem, but something much darker and desperate. The decision was made. If he wanted to discover the truth, he would need to blend in. I couldn't arrive as the CEO everyone respected or feared. It needed to be one of them. The next day, he looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize himself. The hair, always well-aligned, was shorter and messy. His face, previously clean-shaven, now showed a faint shadow of tiredness. The designer clothes gave way to a worn-out uniform, bought hastily in a random store. His name was no longer Leonardo Vasconcelos, founder and president of Metal 40 SA now. He was Carlos, an ordinary man looking for work. He took a packed bus to the factory, something he hadn't done in years. The heat, the pushing, the smell of sweat mixed with cheap perfume. Already there, he realized that his luxurious routine was very far from the reality of his employees. When he arrived at the factory gate, he felt butterflies in his stomach. What if they recognized him? What if it failed? He took a deep breath and headed to the recruitment department. A woman with small glasses and a tired face looked at him over the papers. Name, he asked without looking away from the file. Carlos Andrade. Experience, he hesitated for a second. He couldn't tell the truth, so he improvised. I worked at another metallurgical company for a while, but I was laid off. I need the job. The woman sighed, stamped a document, and pushed it towards him. Lucky for you. We need people. Change your clothes and go to the assembly department. Don't be late. And so, without questions, without suspicions, he was admitted to the company itself. In the locker room, he saw men hurriedly changing their clothes, talking about impossible goals and strict bosses. If Tonho catches us messing around, we're screwed, said one of them. He almost sent Paulo away yesterday just because he was late at lunch, replied another. Leonardo, or rather, Carlos, heard everything in silence. Who was Tonho? Why were they so scared? Upon entering the production line, the noise of the machines was deafening. The treadmill didn't stop, and the employees worked at a frantic pace. Nobody looked at anyone. They just fitted pieces together, tightened screws, and hurried on. Suddenly, a deep voice echoed through the warehouse. Come on, you nerds, faster. Anyone who doesn't meet the goal is out. Carlos turned his head and saw a burly man with crossed arms, an impatient look, and an authoritarian tone. This could only be Tonho. He watched the employees like a lurking predator, waiting for the slightest flaw to pounce. An employee next to Carlos trembled and dropped a piece. The metallic clang cut through the air, and the conveyor belt continued moving. The man hurriedly tried to catch her, but he was too late. Tonho advanced like an angry bull. What was that? Alvaro? Sorry, boss. It was an accident. Unintentionally. Hello. There's no room for error here. Do you want to lose your job? No, sir. Then move those hands before I rip them off myself. Carlos felt his blood boil. That was unacceptable. I wanted to intervene, say that this was no way to treat an employee, but if I spoke, I would ruin everything. At the end of the shift, in the locker room, he approached Alvaro. Man, is this boss always like this? Alvaro sighed, sitting on the bench. Always. And it gets worse when the numbers are so bad. We don't even complain anymore. Anyone who complains is sent away. Carlos felt a tightness in his chest. How many more were being treated like this? What else would he discover in the coming days? He came looking for answers. But the truth was turning out to be much worse than anyone imagined. Carlos arrived at the factory just before the first shift started. The main gate was already crowded with employees, most of them with deep circles under their eyes and tired expressions, as if this were just another endless day in a suffocating routine. The smell of burning oil mixed with the sweat of the workers and the metallic noise of the machines could already be heard from inside the warehouse. He joined the group as they entered and noticed something immediately. No one was smiling. Nobody talked enthusiastically. There were only shuffling footsteps and blank stares. It was as if everyone there was just surviving, counting the hours until the end of the day. As soon as he passed through the gate, a tall, burly man wearing a supervisor's vest began shouting, "Go away! I don't want to see people stop." The work cannot be done alone. Carlos watched in silence. The man moved among the employees like a general inspecting soldiers, ready to punish anyone who wasn't up to speed. When a young worker who looked to be in his early 20s hesitated for a second to tie his shoelaces, the supervisor brutally advanced on him. He was sent to his post in the assembly department. As soon as he entered the warehouse, he was engulfed in suffocating heat. Fans rotated on the ceiling, but they couldn't handle the heavy air filled with smoke and dust. The workers worked at a fast pace, sweating under fluorescent lights that flickered every now and then, as if they too were on the verge of exhaustion. A thin man, with features hardened by time, approached Carlos with an apron stained with grease. "New here?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the treadmill. "Yes, they called me this morning," Carlos replied. The man let out a dry laugh. "Then good luck. If you survive the first week, you might have a chance to stay." Carlos swallowed. "Is it that bad?" "You'll see. Just try not to make mistakes. They don't like mistakes around here." Before I could ask further, the siren sounded. Machines started to work, and the conveyor belt began to move quickly. Carlos watched the workers in action. Each had a specific and repetitive task. Take a piece, turn it, tighten 2 screws, and release it onto the belt. Repeat. No pause, no rest. He tried to keep up, but soon realized it wasn't that simple. The treadmill wasn't waiting for anyone, and a second of distraction could compromise the entire flow. He felt sweat running down his forehead and the muscles in his arms starting to complain after just half an hour. How could someone do that for 8-10 hours straight? The answer came quickly. A scream cut through the sound of the machines. "You there! What are you doing?" Carlos looked to the side and saw a supervisor approaching with heavy steps. It was the same man who had shouted at the gate earlier. "Do you think this is a joke? Production cannot stop because you are slow." Carlos felt his blood boil. The instinct to impose himself spoke louder, but he held back. He couldn't reveal himself. "Sorry, boss. I'm still getting the hang of it." "Catch IT faster," roared the supervisor. "If I have to give you another score, you can consider yourself out." The man walked away, and Carlos went back to work, this time more attentive. He could give no reason for distrust, but indignation grew within him. At halftime, he met Alvaro again, the worker he had met in the locker room the day before. The man sat in the shade, holding a crushed sandwich that barely looked appetizing. "Are you able to keep up?" he asked, between one bite and another. Carlos sighed. "This is hell." Alvaro let out a bitter laugh. "And you haven't seen anything yet. Wait until forced overtime begins." Carlos' eyes widened. Overtime. But I didn't see anything about that in the contract because they don't put it. But if you don't stay after hours when you're told to, you can quit your job. Carlos felt his indignation increase. With each new discovery, it became clearer that his company was far from being the fair and correct environment he imagined. And worse, no one said anything out of fear. When the siren sounded announcing the end of the break, he returned to his post, feeling that something inside him was beginning to change. That first day at the factory would not just be an experience to understand the employee's routine. It would be the beginning of a journey that would reveal truths he never imagined he would find. The siren sounded again, and the employees stood up silently, as if they were tied to an invisible mechanism. No laughter, no small talk, just tired bodies heading back to their posts. Carlos returned to the production line, feeling the weight of the routine settle on his shoulders. As the first batch of parts began to slide down the conveyor belt, he realized something had changed. The pace was even faster than before the break. The employees' movements were fast, automatic, as if they were already programmed to keep up with that new speed. He tried to go with the flow, but his hands weren't yet used to the intense repetition. In the second batch, it was already late. Hurry up! The voice of Tanho, the brutish supervisor, echoed through the warehouse. Let's not be behind because of slow people. Carlos swallowed hard, speeding up his movements. He saw the other workers sweating, their faces tense, hands shaking with effort. One mistake, and the treadmill would go on without you, making it clear that your time was not important. Suddenly, a dull thump interrupted the noise of the machines. A piece fell to the floor. The sound of metal hitting concrete cut through the air like a gunshot. Carlos turned his head in time to see a young employee, barely in his 20s, flinch as he realized what he had done. The silence lasted a second before being swallowed by Tanho's fury. Who was the incompetent one? The boy tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. His hand shook as he bent down to pick up the fallen piece. Is there a problem with your brain? Boy, do you know how much a mistake like this costs? Sorry. Boss, sorry I didn't pay the loss. If you make a mistake again, you can be found on the street. Nobody moved. Nobody defended the boy. It was as if everyone was already used to that scene. Carlos felt a fury rising inside him, but he couldn't do anything. Not yet. When the siren sounded again announcing a short break, he approached the young man who was leaning against the warehouse wall, panting. Are you okay? The boy looked up scared. Who are you? Carlos. I started today. The boy took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. I'm Felipe. Does this guy always do this? Felipe let out a humorless laugh. Tanho, always. He loves to humiliate us. He says it's to teach, but the truth is that he just wants to see who can last the longest without falling apart. Carlos looked around. Several employees were sitting on the floor or leaning against machines, catching their breath. Everyone looked like they were about to faint. Is this normal? This rhythm? Felipe nodded without emotion. Every afternoon, they increase the speed of the treadmill. They want to ensure that the goal is reached before the end of the working day. If it doesn't work, we'll stay after hours. Carlos frowned. But what about overtime? Do you get paid for this? Felipe let out a bitter laugh. If you ask about this, you can consider yourself fired. Carlos felt a knot in his stomach. How could this be happening within the company itself? He always believed that his employees were treated well, that the factory was a safe place. But there, in that stuffy warehouse, surrounded by exhausted and unmotivated faces, the truth was different. The break was over, and everyone returned to their posts. This time, Carlos tried his best to keep up with the pace, but he felt his muscles burning with each repetition. He looked around and saw a frail old man with his face bathed in sweat, trying to keep up the pace. He was breathing hard, and with each piece assembled, he seemed weaker, until suddenly he stopped. The man leaned on the counter, placing his hand on his chest. The color drained from his face. Hey, hey, are you okay? Carlos approached, but before he could do anything, he heard the scream. What is going on here? Tanho came marching towards them, eyes sparkling. He's not well, Carlos started to speak, but the supervisor completely ignored him. Get up, Alfredo. Come on, will you be cool now? You tried to take a deep breath, but you couldn't. I need a minute, he murmured, his voice trailing off. Tanho snorted. You're new here, right? Let me teach you something. If he can talk, he can work. Carlos felt his blood boil. What if he passes out? Tanho shrugged. Then we move it out of the way and put another one in its place. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Alfredo, shaking, tried to stand up on his own, but his legs gave out. Two colleagues rushed to catch him, helping him off the production line. Carlos watched everything with contained fury. He had seen enough. If before I had doubts about what was happening in that factory, now I was sure, and he was going to do something about it. Carlos was already exhausted. His body ached in a way he had never felt before. Every muscle seemed to scream in protest, but he couldn't stop. None of them could. The crazy pace of the production line continued, and any slip-up was punished with screams and humiliation. When the siren finally announced the break, he dragged himself to a far corner of the warehouse, taking a deep breath to try to catch his breath. Beside him, other employees did the same. Some threw themselves on the floor anyway, while others leaned against the walls with their eyes closed, as if they were trying to enjoy every second of that brief rest. It was then that Carlos heard the voice of an older man. He spoke quietly, but his tone was desperate. Please, boss, I only need one day. Just one day. Carlos turned around and saw a gray-haired man, probably in his 60s, talking to Tanho, the cruel supervisor. The man was visibly haggard, sweating coldly and holding his side as if in pain. His breathing was heavy and ragged, and even without knowing him, Carlos knew right away he was sick. Tanho crossed his arms, impatient. What is this story, Geraldo? Are you looking for a break now? The man swallowed hard and tried to maintain his posture. I've been feeling sick for a few days, boss. I think I got an infection or something. I need to go to the doctor if you can release me tomorrow. Tanho snorted and took a step forward, looking directly into the employee's eyes. I promise I'll make it up to you later. The supervisor laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh. Oh, will it make up for it? How, if you can barely stand? Geraldo was silent. Look here, old man. If you leave here to go to the doctor, you don't need to come back, understand? Because no one will hold your spot for you. There are people out there who want this job. Carlos felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. He saw Geraldo clench his fists as if he wanted to say something, but gave up halfway. The humiliation was written all over his face, but the fear was greater. So ... I'll stay. The elderly man's voice was weak, like a whisper. Tanho gave a satisfied smile. Good boy. Now get out of here and return to your post at the right time. Carlos couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could that be happening? How come no one did anything? He looked around and saw that the other employees had witnessed everything, but were avoiding looking at Geraldo. Nobody wanted to get involved. That's how it worked there. Either you submitted or you were out. When Tanho walked away, Carlos approached slowly. Hey, sir ... are you okay? Geraldo looked at him with tired eyes. Who are you? I'm new here. My name is Carlos. The elderly man sighed and passed his hand over his sweaty face. Then learn something. Carlos ... in here. Nobody cares about us. If you start caring too much, you will end up hurting yourself. Carlos felt a lump in his throat. But you're feeling bad ... that's not right. Geraldo let out a bitter laugh. Nothing here is certain. Boy. But we need to pay the bills, right? Carlos was speechless. The siren rang again, and the elderly man just shook his head before slowly getting up with a groan of pain. He returned to his post as if nothing had happened, as if your health was worthless. Carlos closed his hands tightly. Something inside him had changed at that moment. He could no longer ignore it. I couldn't just pretend nothing was happening. Something needed to be done, and he would. Carlos felt his blood boil every time he saw Geraldo dragging himself along the production line. The man was weak, breathing with difficulty, and, even so, he continued to strain his body to avoid losing his job. But it wasn't just him. Now that he was paying attention, Carlos began to notice details that he had previously ignored. Deep dark circles on the employees' faces, muffled coughs between one room and another, hands shaking with exhaustion. The warehouse was full of sick or weak people, but no one seemed willing to talk about it. That night, Carlos couldn't sleep. Every scene of what he had witnessed replayed in his mind. He needed to understand what was really happening. If there was something wrong with working conditions, I needed to find out the extent of it. The next day, he used his lunch break to infiltrate one of the administrative offices. He walked through the factory's narrow corridors until he found the door marked health and safety reports. He looked around, making sure no one was paying attention to him, and quickly entered. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he rummaged through files. He picked up some recent folders and started leafing through the documents. To his surprise, the reports said that accident rates at the factory were minimal and that there were virtually no sick days. But that didn't make sense. He himself had seen workers fainting, shaking with fever, and calling for help. Leafing through more quickly, he found a medical report from an employee named Ricardo Farias. According to the document, he was removed for health reasons 2 months ago, but Carlos had never heard anyone talk about him. The name was not on the payment records, and it appeared that the man had simply disappeared. Suddenly, a noise in the hallway made his heart race. Someone was approaching. Without time to think, Carlos stuffed some documents inside his shirt and closed the drawer at the exact moment the door opened. "What the hell are you doing here?" Carlos turned around and found Tanjo, the supervisor, standing at the door, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "I got lost," he improvised. "I was looking for the bathroom." Tanjo didn't seem convinced. "The bathroom is on the other side. Get out of here before I decide to give you a real reason for needing the infirmary." Carlos nodded quickly and left the room, trying to control his breathing. That night, already at home, he spread the documents on the kitchen table and began to analyze everything more calmly. That was when he found something that left him completely astonished. The company had recorded the deaths of at least 5 employees in the last year due to natural causes. But alongside the names, Carlos recognized some stories. One of them was Ricardo Farias, who had officially been removed, but according to another report he found, died a week later. The cause, respiratory complications. Another name on the list belonged to a woman named Marina Souza, who had a sudden faint in the middle of work and died before getting medical attention. Carlos ran his hands over his face, trying to process what he had just discovered. This wasn't just negligence, it was something much worse. Workers were dying inside that factory, and the company was covering everything up. His heart was beating fast. He knew that if he tried to expose this, he would take a big risk. But there was no turning back. He couldn't just ignore it. The next day, he returned to work, but now with a new objective: to gather enough evidence to reveal the truth. Carlos spent the night awake. The papers scattered across the table were proof enough that the factory not only neglected its employees, but also covered up deaths as if they were insignificant numbers on a spreadsheet. The weight of the truth crushed his shoulders in a way he had never felt before. For years, he believed his company was an example of success, a model of efficiency and productivity. But now, disguised as a normal worker, he saw what really happened behind the scenes. He always knew that production line work was difficult, but he never imagined it to be inhumane. Sitting there, staring at the falsified reports, he felt a lump in his throat. How did you let this happen? How did you allow your company to reach this point without him even suspecting it? He remembered the office meetings, the charts, the impeccable presentations that always showed an efficient operation and happy employees. All lies. He was surrounded by disguised numbers, manipulated statistics, and beautiful words that hid a cruel reality. He closed his eyes and listened to the voices echoing in his mind. "Please, boss, I just need one day." The memory of Geraldo begging for a minimum of dignity made his stomach turn. He saw the tired look of the old worker, the fear in his voice, the submission forced by necessity. Afterwards, he remembered Tanho laughing, mocking the suffering of a sick man as if it were something banal. Carlos got up and started pacing back and forth. He always believed he was a good leader. He was always proud of having built that company from scratch, but now he saw that he was blind. He trusted managers who only cared about targets, profits, and cost cutting, without caring about what happened on the factory floor. It was his responsibility. He was the CEO. In the end, it was his fault. The thought of revealing his identity and taking action immediately crossed his mind, but he hesitated. If he confronted those responsible now, it might be too late. He needed more proof. He needed to know how far that hole went. Who else was involved? Did the directors know all this? Or was it just a network of greedy supervisors taking advantage of the lack of oversight? Indignation grew inside him, but with it came a fear that he didn't want to admit. Throughout his career, he was always at the top of the hierarchy, protected by numbers, reports, and assistants who filtered everything before it reached him. But now he was here, in the shoes of a common worker, seeing with his own eyes the brutality of a system he himself had created without realizing it. The factory siren sounded at dawn. Carlos took a deep breath. He could no longer go back. If I wanted to change that reality, I would have to play the game until the end. The last shift of the day was the most difficult for Carlos. Every movement, every word, every furtive glance he exchanged with his co-workers seemed to weigh more and more on his shoulders. What he had discovered in the last few days was untenable. It wasn't just a question of poor conditions. It was a matter of lives being disregarded, of people being used as disposable parts in a ruthless production machine. But what he feared most now was what would come next. How would you reveal your identity? How would you face your supervisors and directors? And, more importantly, how would workers react? He glanced at the other employees as they began to prepare to leave. Most were so exhausted they could barely keep their eyes open. Some dragged themselves to the changing room, others sat on the edge of the warehouse, waiting to be transported home. He knew they were all living a lie he had been fed all this time without even realizing it. Carlos could no longer hide. It was already too late to turn back. He made a decision. At the end of the day, when the production line stopped for good, he would do what needed to be done. It was time to face the truth and expose it to everyone, regardless of the consequences. The wall clock in the break room finally marked the end of the shift. The warehouse's fluorescent lights began to turn off automatically, and employees began to leave their posts. The sound of the machine stopping was almost a relief for everyone. They could leave for a few more hours, but Carlos knew that wasn't enough. What would happen after the factory closed was even more important. He headed to the center of the factory, where all the employees were gathering. Some looked at him curiously, others suspiciously, as he was still wearing the simple disguise of a worker. He took a deep breath and took the first step towards the makeshift stage, where supervisors normally gave instructions. Supervisor Tanho had his back turned, talking to another colleague. Carlos stopped in the middle of the warehouse and, with a decisive gesture, took off the cap that covered his short hair and let his hair down. The machines were silent now, and the sound of their action was enough to attract everyone's attention. Tanho turned around in fright. "What are you doing, you idiot?" Tanho shouted, thinking he was just joking or trying to make a bad joke, but Carlos didn't respond. Calmly, he began to take off the simple t-shirt he was wearing, revealing his formal shirt underneath. He wasn't afraid of being recognized, not anymore. On the contrary, he was willing to be seen. "I'm Carlos Almeida, the CEO of this company," he said, his voice firm but filled with tension that he couldn't hide. The shock was immediate. Conversation stopped abruptly. Eyes turned to him as if he were a stranger, an unexpected presence that had suddenly materialized in the midst of that chaos. Tanho stood still for a moment, unable to process what he had just heard. He looked at the other supervisors, who were also perplexed. "What? You? Are you the CEO?" Tanho asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. Carlos motioned for everyone to come closer, raising his hand to ask for silence. He didn't want to hide anything anymore. I no longer wanted to live in a bubble of lies and appearances. It was time to take responsibility for everything that was happening. Yes, I'm the CEO, and I'm here because I saw what happens inside this factory. I saw the exploitation, neglect, and death of some of you, while you were all being deceived by people who, like me, turned a blind eye to reality. I betrayed them, just as we betrayed them all. That revelation fell like a bomb in the middle of the factory. The workers looked at each other in surprise, some still not believing what they were hearing. Supervisor Tanho, now visibly disconcerted, tried to compose himself. That's a lie. You're trying to destabilize us, Carlos. We always did everything for the best. Carlos looked directly into Tanho's eyes and, for the first time, spoke with all the anger that had been building up. The best for whom? Tanho, for you and your interests, perhaps. But what about the workers? What about those who are dying without even receiving decent treatment? Is this what you call better? The other supervisors began to walk away, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. The tension in the air was palpable. A woman at the back of the warehouse, who Carlos recognized as a worker named Donna Marta, raised her hand hesitantly. She seemed to have something to say. I knew something was wrong. I saw the changes in the work environment, the accidents happening, but no one cared. You never showed up here to see how we were doing. He never worried about our health or our dignity. I lost my husband here. He died 6 months ago, and nobody did anything. Donna Marta said, her voice breaking with emotion. Carlos felt the weight of her words like a sharp blade. What he heard now was no longer just a denunciation. It was the desperate cry of a woman who had lost something that could never be recovered. I know, Marta. I failed you all. But now, I'm going to change that. I will make sure you all get the treatment you deserve. I will investigate every report, every supervisor, every action that was taken without consideration by you. Marta's eyes softened a little, but the pain was still there. She just nodded, as if she no longer had the strength to fight. Carlos turned to the other workers, now all silent, waiting for more words. I don't know what will happen from now on, but I promise all of you that, as long as I'm at the helm of this company, nothing like this will happen again. I will not allow more lives to be lost in the name of cheap profit. The reaction was mixed. Some applauded timidly, others were still too stunned to react. But for Carlos, the most important thing was that he had finally freed himself from the lie. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but the truth was already exposed. Now he would have to face the consequences of his actions and act to right everything that was wrong. Carlos felt the weight of the decision in every step he took. He had finally revealed his identity as CEO, exposed the harsh realities of the factory and, on some level, begun to admit his failure in not realizing the pain and sacrifices made by those who worked under him. Now, what he wanted most was to act. It wasn't enough to just talk. He needed to turn words into concrete actions, and he needed to do it immediately. The next morning, Carlos was in the board office, meeting with his executive team. He watched his subordinates, those he had always considered trustworthy partners. But now, each of them seemed like a reflection of what he needed to change. Instead of a collaborative environment, that space seemed like a closed bubble of personal interests and disconnected from the company's real needs. He could no longer tolerate it. I need you all to understand one thing. Starting today, everything is going to change. Carlos declared, his voice firm, but filled with an urgency that could not be ignored. The first measure will be the immediate dismissal of supervisors who failed in their duties. No employee, no worker should be treated with abuse or disrespect. Let's stop the humiliation and threats. The atmosphere in the room became heavy. The directors began to exchange nervous glances, some already uncomfortable with the idea of losing their positions of power. But Carlos Carlos didn't care about their discomfort. He cared about the people who were working there day after day without even being able to defend themselves. Tan-ho, for example, Carlos continued, looking fixedly at the operations director, who seemed completely disconcerted. "Will be fired immediately. Your behavior will no longer be tolerated at any level within the company." Tan-ho tried to argue, but Carlos left no room for excuses or justifications. He already knew that words were no longer useful. What he needed were actions. In the following days, Carlos worked tirelessly to completely overhaul the factory's management. He fired the supervisors and managers who had become an oppressive force for employees, those who unceremoniously treated workers like disposable parts. Some of those fired tried to appeal, claiming that their methods were necessary to keep production high, but Carlos did not give in. For him, human value would always be more important than any short-term goal or objective. I know that many of you think that the main purpose of the factory is just production and profit. But the truth is, without you, the workers, none of this would be possible. Let's start treating everyone with the respect and dignity they deserve. He told all employees in a general meeting minutes after the changes began to be implemented. The next day, he began creating psychological and medical support programs for all employees. None of them would feel alone in their pain or suffering anymore. Carlos hired specialized professionals to meet any type of mental or physical health need. Everyone, without exception, would have access to what they needed to ensure well-being. He knew this wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. Furthermore, Carlos made a point of establishing a system of transparency in reports. Every decision would be documented and accessible to all employees. Any data relating to health and safety at work would be public, and he committed to rigorously monitoring working environments and conditions. A new code of conduct was also created. From that moment on, no worker would be forced to follow impossible goals or work excessive hours that would put their health at risk. Carlos made a point of explaining that productivity would no longer be measured just by the quantity of parts produced, but by the quality of the work environment, the well-being of employees, and the ethics with which the company was run. The atmosphere at the factory began to change. At first, the distrust was palpable. Workers were used to seeing empty promises and superficial changes. But Carlos' actions spoke louder than any words. He wasn't just there to promise. He was there to act and to correct the mistakes of the past. Donna Marta, the woman who had lost her husband due to working conditions, was one of the first to notice the changes. When Carlos passed her in the cafeteria, she looked at him with an expression of surprise, but also of hope. "I don't know if everything will change, but I see an effort," she said in a low voice, unable to hide her emotion. Carlos stopped in front of her, feeling the weight of her words. He knelt in front of her so they could look into each other's eyes. "I just hope that, in time, you and everyone else can see that we are doing all this for you, for your dignity and for your safety," he replied with a sincerity he had never felt before. Little by little, the workers began to talk to each other. There was a renewed sense of camaraderie between them. There was no longer fear of reprisals or suffering punishment. They felt seen, heard, and most importantly, respected. The production line continued to run, but now there was something new in the air. Something that couldn't be measured in numbers, but that was palpable in the environment. Trust. Carlos, however, knew that the battle was not won. He was just beginning the journey to rebuild what had been destroyed. To ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated, he knew he would need to be tireless. He also knew that the company's culture wouldn't change overnight. He would have to fight every day to maintain that commitment to the well-being of his employees. He was determined because, more than ever, he knew he wasn't just changing the company. He was changing lives. And that was just the beginning. In the months that followed, Carlos continued to dedicate himself tirelessly to restructuring the factory. He organized training workshops for new supervisors, focused on empathetic leadership and ethical management. Additionally, he partnered with unions to ensure that workers' rights were always respected. Each day, the factory began to transform from a place of oppression into an environment of collaboration and respect. And as the changes took place, Carlos saw the results. Productivity increased, but in a more humane way. Workers were more motivated and more willing to contribute their skills as they now felt they were part of something bigger, something that respected their needs and dignity. It was a new era for the factory, and for Carlos, a new era of leadership where success would no longer just be measured in numbers, but in the lives of the people who made everything possible. Months have passed since Carlos made the decision to reveal his identity and make the real transformation within the factory. The environment that was once filled with tension, fear, and hopelessness now exuded a different energy. It was not just the physical appearance of the facilities that had changed, but the atmosphere of the factory itself. Order and discipline were still present, but now accompanied by a fundamental respect for the dignity of each worker. The machines worked non-stop, but their sound was almost a melody in the middle of a place where people finally felt valued. Carlos was in his office, which now had a panoramic view of the production line. It was difficult to believe how that previously cold and impersonal space had become a point of observation of the changes he had promoted. He had taken each measure with fierce determination, but now he felt something more. It was a feeling he couldn't put into words, something he didn't know if he could have anticipated. He was at peace with the choices he had made. He looked at his computer and saw the latest productivity report. The numbers were better than he imagined. Production was up. But what was more surprising was the increase in employee satisfaction. The turnover rate had fallen drastically, and workplace accidents had reduced notably. Most impressive of all was the workers' engagement. They now felt part of something bigger. It was as if the factory's purpose had been rewritten. Carlos, we have a meeting with the union and some of the representatives from each sector. The voice of Helena, his assistant, sounded from the other side of the door. Carlos got up from his chair, adjusting his tie with more attention than usual. He had gotten used to the new routine of his life as CEO, but he knew there was still a lot to be done. When he entered the meeting room, he was immediately greeted with smiles and handshakes. Union leaders and representatives from each sector seemed more relaxed, more confident. There was a mutual respect in the air, something that would never have been possible before the changes he had implemented. "Good morning, everyone," Carlos said, smiling as he sat at the head of the table. "I know everyone has worked hard to get here, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being by our side in this process. It's not easy to change something so big, but together we can do it." One of the workers' representatives, Paulo, a middle-aged man with a bushy beard, stood up with a genuine smile. "Carlos, I know many of us were skeptical at first, but honestly, the transformation was visible. The factory now has a different atmosphere, a different rhythm. We feel that the company cares about our health and our safety. I can't help but say that after so many years of struggle, it seems like we finally found someone willing to listen." Carlos smiled, touched by Paulo's words. But that wasn't the only thing that moved him. He remembered those weeks when, as a simple undercover worker, he had witnessed the pain, suffering, and hopelessness of his colleagues. He knew he couldn't go back, that change needed to be lasting and profound. And now, with the reports and results, he felt he was on the right track. "I am grateful to all of you," said Carlos, his voice now calmer, but full of conviction. "And I want you to know that this is not my victory. It's a victory for all of us. We are all in this together. If we continue like this, I'm sure we will achieve much more." The atmosphere in the room was one of celebration, but also of reflection. Everyone knew that the changes were just the beginning. The true transformation of corporate culture would not happen overnight. It was necessary to maintain focus and continue the constant work of valuing human beings, not just profits. Carlos knew that his mission as a leader was now clearer than ever. he had learned valuable lessons about empathy, transparency, and leadership. Over the next few days, the changes Carlos had made began to be felt more deeply. He began making daily visits to the different sectors of the factory. Before, he barely had time for this, too busy with negotiations and reports. But now he was determined to make being close to his workers an essential part of his routine. He talked to them, listened to their concerns, listened to them tell their stories. Carlos had become not only the leader of the company, but someone people could count on. On one of those days, while he was talking to Donna Marta on the production line, she told him something that would forever remain in his memory. "Carlos, I never thought I would see the day when someone in your position would come to us to listen to our stories, to see with your own eyes what we went through. I know that changes still need to happen in many other areas, but what you did has already changed our lives." Carlos looked at her, feeling a wave of gratitude and humility. He knew Marta's words were sincere, but they also represented something bigger. The real change was not just in the reforms he implemented at the factory, but in the way he began to see his role as a leader. Over the next few months, he continued to work side by side with workers and managers to ensure progress continued. The company was no longer just a place to work, but a community where everyone had a voice and a say. The impact of the change he brought went beyond the factory walls. The surrounding community also began to notice the difference. Carlos's company became an example of good business practices, a model of how prosperity could be achieved in an ethical and respectful manner. Carlos, however, knew that the real reward was not in awards or external recognition. The real reward was seeing the faces of the workers, their eyes shining with hope for a better, fairer future. He was aware that he could no longer return to the old leadership model. He had learned the hard way the true value of being a human leader. As the months passed, he continued to make small and large changes, always asking himself how he could further improve conditions for his employees. He knew the journey was long and the challenges were many, but for the first time he felt he was on the right path. A path of truth, respect, and, above all, humanity. Now, when he looked at the company's reports and financial results, he saw more than just numbers. He saw the lives behind each production, the dreams and hopes of each worker, and for him, that was the greatest success he could achieve. The factory transformation was not just a change in the work environment. It was proof that true leadership begins with the ability to see others as human beings and not as numbers. For Carlos, this was the most real and valuable impact he could have achieved. And he knew that, in the end, that impact was the true legacy he wanted to leave for the company and for everyone who worked there.